Napoleon's Egypt, Invading the Middle East by Juan. So I don't know about you, but Napoleon's Egypt has always been one of those subjects that has come up in the periphery of other books I've been reading. When I was a kid, I was quite fascinated with ancient history and used to read a lot of books on ancient Egypt, in which they would typically mention that this was uncovered by Napoleon soldiers, or this was uncovered when the French were in Egypt. So you get kind of glimpses of this strange period when the French were controlling Egypt. But of course you don't get the full story. And then later, when I was older and I was taking an interest in the Napoleonic Wars, they often mention Napoleon's fiasco in Egypt, but they mention it mostly as an aside. You know, it wasn't like the main story of what was happening in Europe. There was just like this little detail of this Egyptian debacle. So for a long time, I felt like I never got a book that gave me the whole story of what was happening in Egypt, this fascinating little excursion that Napoleon did down to Egypt at the end of the 18th century. And then I saw this book in the bookstore, and I thought, oh, perfect, a whole book on Napoleon in Egypt. Now, part of the fascination of Napoleon in Egypt, I guess, has to do with the age of empires and, you know, this whole exoticism of the Western empires going into these Middle Eastern places, which I guess is maybe a little bit outdated now, but I still find it interesting. And that is in here. You know, you have French soldiers battling the Bedouin nomads, French soldiers getting eaten by crocodiles in the Nile River, and the Rosetta Stone, and kind of all this exoticism of ancient Egypt and modern France and stuff like that. But the book also has a political edge, and you can tell that maybe by the subtitle, Invading the Middle East. So this book came out in the early 2000s during the whole Iraq War debacle. And Juan is very interested in talking about the parallels about a modern Western democracy invading a Middle Eastern country. In fact, the parallels run a lot deeper than I thought they would. So, during the time of this invasion, this was before Napoleon was Emperor of France, excuse me. At this time, in 1798, France was still technically a republic. It had gone through many phases in the 1790s. But Napoleon was a general under the French Republic at this time. He wasn't yet the emperor. So this was a story of a republic that invaded a Middle East nation. And France at that time was the only republic in Europe, and they viewed it as their mission to spread liberty and freedom around the world. Now, this invasion of Egypt was a little bit bizarre. It was partly for strategic reasons, but it was, as Juan notes, also partly influenced by the rhetoric of freedom and democracy. So the French viewed it as their mission to spread freedom and democracy around the world. Egypt at that time was controlled by the Ottoman Empire under the Turkish rulers. And the French thought that once they overthrew the Turkish rulers, the Egyptians would rise up and greet them as liberators. And they were very confused when this didn't happen, and the Egyptians resisted them as foreign invaders. Now, perhaps the parallels to the Iraq War are becoming more and more obvious. It's interesting because by the time of this Egyptian campaign, Napoleon had already established himself as the most brilliant military tactician in Europe. Again, he wasn't yet Emperor of France, but in the 1790s, he had already smashed the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Italians. And after smashing all of the best militaries in Europe, everybody thought that this invasion of a backwards Muslim country would be a walk in the park. It would be a piece of cake. Instead, France just got itself sunk into this huge disaster of a quagmire. Now, the parallels to the modern-day Iraq war that Juan Cole was able to dig up are amazing. There's even a debate among the French about whether or not it's useful to use torture against the Muslim insurgents, which Juan Cole reproduces that debate. And incidentally, the French eventually concluded that torture may be effective as a punishment, but it's useless as a way to get information, because the victim will just say whatever they think will end the torture the quickest. In other words, whatever they think their torturers will want to hear. So you remember that whole debate that was going on in the early 2000s about whether torture was a useful way of getting information from insurgents. Now, if you read some of the critics of Juan Cole, and I went to the review page on Amazon, a lot of people, some people, are critical of the fact that he's drawing too many parallels to modern day. They say, just tell us the history, leave the politics out of it. But I thought it was fair game. And for the most part, Juan Cole does not draw the connections explicitly. I mean, we all know what he's thinking. But very rarely does he use his authorial voice to say, okay, now take note, this is a direct parallel to what's going on nowadays. He doesn't say that. He just says what's going on, and the reader can draw the obvious parallel. Now, I'm sure there was probably some selecting of information that went into the writing of this book, but I think that's fair game. If he can go through the historical record and find these parallels, I think that's legitimate. That being said, there are a couple exceptions where he does use his authorial voice. For example, he explicitly draws the reader's attentions to Napoleon's attempt to set up a Muslim government of clerics in Egypt, and explicitly draws a parallel with the U.S. attempts to do the same in Iraq. Reading this book, I got a huge sense of frustration that our leaders in Washington were not able to use the historical record to be better informed on what was likely to happen in Iraq. Now, I mean, granted, this book itself came out after the invasion of Iraq, but all the historical sources that Juan Cole is drawing on were in the public domain. So you feel like the people in Washington who were making these policy decisions should have known better and should have researched this better, and it's frustrating that they didn't. All that being said, this book caters very nicely to the history geek as well. In other words, it's not simply for the parallels to modern day or for the political lessons that you'd want to read this book. Juan Cole also does a nice job of filling in your knowledge about this period in history, which at least in my experience, there's not a lot written about Napoleon in Egypt. It seems to be either a side story to the Napoleonic Wars, or it seems to be a side story to the story of archaeological excavation in Egypt. My only big complaint about this book, at least as a history, is it's got a lot of problems with the third act. So as I got closer and closer to the end, I kept wondering how Juan Cole was possibly going to have room to wrap up everything in the little space he had left in the book. And in fact, the end of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign is just reduced to a quick summary in the last chapter, which is disappointing. I think Juan Cole dropped the ball a little bit here. There was so much detail in the early chapters. I was hoping we were going to get just as much detail talking about the end of the campaign. But in fact, it comes to a rather abrupt and disappointing ending. So that's unfortunate. But all in all, the book as a whole is highly readable. And it works great either as a history or as a political commentary. So I'd recommend it if you're interested in this period.